The envelope arrived at historian F.W. Winterbotham's London flat in the autumn of 1974, marked with a single word stamped in red ink, approved. Inside lay permission to publish what he had carried in silence for 3 decades, the story of Ultra, the code-breaking program that had tilted the Second World War toward Allied victory. For 29 years, he and thousands of others had kept the secret, not from enemies. The enemies were long defeated. They had kept it from everyone. The mathematics of victory had been written in silence. Winterbotham's manuscript, The Ultra Secret, would shatter the comfortable narrative of how the Allies won the war. Across the Atlantic, American veterans who had fought in North Africa and Europe opened their morning papers to discover that battles they remembered as narrow victories had been fought with an invisible advantage. The enemy's plans, read before they were issued, ship positions known before they sailed, attack orders decoded while the ink still dried, every convoy route, every U-boat patrol, every Panzer Division's morning briefing, all of it had flowed through the electromechanical drums of machines at Bletchley Park, translated by mathematicians and linguists who would take the secret to their graves unless officially released. The revelation raised a question that had never been asked. What else had been kept hidden? In June 1941, British codebreakers began grouping intercepted German high command traffic under a cover designation, Ultra, that would remain an official state secret for nearly 3 full decades. The program employed over 10,000 personnel at its peak, processing thousands of decrypted messages weekly. Yet when the war ended in May 1945, every participant signed renewed secrecy oaths. Files were locked, machines were destroyed. The official history recorded Allied intelligence as brilliant guesswork, aggressive reconnaissance, and exceptional field commanders. No mention of the invisible pipeline that had delivered enemy secrets in real time. The silence carried operational weight. Throughout the war, Ultra's existence demanded a cruel calculus. To protect the source, Allied commanders staged elaborate deceptions, phony reconnaissance flights over targets already pinpointed by decoded messages, fabricated reports from invented spy networks. The British even created a fictional master agent, codenamed Boniface, whose intelligence reports could explain battlefield prescience without revealing radio intercepts. Wartime intelligence directives, declassified decades later, documented the trade-off in clinical language. Some convoys would be allowed to sail into known ambushes. Some air raids would proceed without warning. The alternative, alerting the Germans that their codes were compromised, would shut down the intelligence pipeline entirely. The human cost of that calculus never appeared in official records. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're finding this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more hidden history to uncover. By the time Winterbotham's book reached shelves, the first waves of declassification had begun washing other secrets into public view. In November 1944, dozens of German U-boats had simply vanished from Allied tracking charts. For years, families received terse notifications: missing, presumed lost. The precise circumstances remained classified. Some wrecks would not be located until sonar surveys in the 21st century revealed them resting in positions that matched or contradicted wartime loss reports. When naval archives finally opened restricted files in the late 20th century, researchers discovered something unsettling. The British Admiralty had possessed the technology to track and target submarines with unprecedented accuracy, but documenting those capabilities in public reports would have exposed advances in underwater detection, so the losses remained vague. The coordinates stayed sealed. The families waited. Inside those archives, historians found something else. Artifacts that had been embargoed for decades. German U-boat crews had carved brief inscriptions on wooden bunks, names, dates, small crosses, that were recovered when wrecks were finally surveyed. Those items, when displayed in naval museums, carried restricted access protocols pending family notification. Some notifications never came. The inscriptions sat in climate-controlled storage, tangible evidence that someone had passed through, had lived, had carved a mark, and then vanished into water and secrecy. But the U-boat files were merely the surface layer. The deeper the archival researchers dug, the more they realized entire categories of wartime activity had been sealed not for years, but for generations. Projects that touched chemical weapons, radiation exposure, human experiments, the kind of research that carried no statute of limitations on public scandal. By the late 1970s, journalists and historians armed with newly passed Freedom of Information laws began requesting files that governments had assumed would never be examined. What emerged from those requests would force a reckoning with what had been done and what had been hidden in the name of victory. A war won in daylight, a truth buried in archives. The first cracks in the silence appeared in the most unexpected places, not in grand revelations from military headquarters, but in the margins of obscure technical reports. A single line in a 1946 medical survey, a paragraph in a logistics memorandum marked for official use only, a shipping manifest from a Pacific island that listed cargo as experimental materials without further detail. Each fragment hinted at operations that had been deliberately scrubbed from official histories. What those fragments revealed would prove more disturbing than any battlefield defeat. The pattern was consistent. Wartime projects involving human subjects, chemical agents, or radiological material carried the longest classification periods. Files that documented conventional military operations, even defeats, were released within decades. But research that touched medical ethics, civilian exposure, or negotiated immunity for war criminals remained sealed well into the 21st century. The logic was bureaucratic but telling. Operational secrets protected capability. These secrets protected reputation. One file would eventually surface that combined all three concerns. It bore a Japanese designation that meant nothing to American archivists when they first catalogued it in 1945. The characters translated simply as Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The reality hiding behind that innocuous title would remain classified for decades, protected not by Japanese silence, but by American complicity. Secrets don't stay buried by accident. They stay buried by choice. The complex at Pingfang sprawled across 6 square kilometers of frozen Manchurian farmland, disguised behind administrative designations and perimeter walls that kept even Japanese occupation officials at a distance. Civilians in nearby villages knew only that the facility processed water and prevented disease, essential work for maintaining troop health in occupied China. What they couldn't know was that the complex contained prison blocks holding thousands of subjects, industrial laboratories producing pathogens by the hundreds of kilograms, and furnaces that operated continuously to eliminate evidence. Between 1936 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 ran what historians would later identify as the largest biological warfare program in modern history. The true scale remained hidden until Allied occupation forces began processing captured documents. When American intelligence officers first entered the ruins of Pingfang in September 1945, they found a facility that had been systematically demolished. Buildings burned, equipment smashed, records scattered or incinerated, but demolition conducted in haste leaves traces. In one partially collapsed laboratory, translators discovered shipping manifests documenting the production of anthrax, plague, and cholera cultures measured not in grams but in hundreds of kilograms. Another building yielded ceramic bombs designed to disperse plague-infected fleas, devices that field reports confirmed had been deployed in Chinese cities. A third structure contained what appeared to be human remains in conditions suggesting experimental exposure. The officers cabled Tokyo headquarters with a request, "What do we do with this?" The answer would come not from military command, but from intelligence services engaged in a different kind of warfare. The Cold War had already begun, and the Soviet Union was conducting its own occupation of Manchuria. American officials faced a calculation stripped of sentiment, allowed detailed biological warfare research to fall into Soviet hands, or secure it first. The price was immunity. Lieutenant General Ishishiro, Unit 731's commander, and his senior staff would escape war crimes prosecution in exchange for complete disclosure of their research findings. No trials, no public testimony, no documentary evidence submitted to international tribunals. The deal was struck in occupied Tokyo between 1946 and 1948, documented in cables that would remain classified for decades. What emerged from that bargain was data purchased with horror. Ishii and his staff provided American researchers with detailed records of frostbite experiments conducted on living subjects to test cold weather injuries, pressure chamber tests measuring human tolerance to altitude, vivisections performed without anesthesia to observe untreated infections, exposure studies documenting how various pathogens progressed through the human body when subjects were denied treatment. The research was methodical, extensive, and utterly indefensible under any civilized legal standard. Yet American scientists studied it carefully. Post-war occupation files maintained by SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, contain repeated references to restricted release protocols surrounding Japanese biological warfare documentation. Internal memoranda noted that disclosure would create complications for Allied prosecution strategies at the Tokyo trials. The Unit 731 personnel had been granted immunity, but publicizing the terms would invite uncomfortable questions about why architects of industrial-scale human experimentation faced no consequences while other war criminals hanged. the silence held for decades. Survivors in China, those who lived through plague outbreaks deliberately seeded in villages, those who watched relatives die in experimental infections, received no acknowledgement, no reparations, no justice. Estimates eventually linked Unit 731 programs to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths across occupied territories. But the files documenting American knowledge of these atrocities and the decision to grant immunity remained sealed in national archives long after other war crimes records became public. Some victories are too ugly to celebrate. The pattern established with Unit 731, trading justice for strategic advantage, would repeat in other theaters. American and British intelligence services scoured defeated Germany for scientists, weapons designers, and researchers whose expertise might prove valuable against the Soviet threat. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi rocket engineers to the United States. The British recruited German chemists who had worked on nerve agents. The files documenting what these scientists had done during the war and what their new employers chose to overlook carried classification stamps that outlasted the lifetimes of those involved. But the most dangerous secrets weren't about what had been done to enemies. They were about what would be done to Allied personnel in the name of preparedness. The United States Army Chemical Corps maintained a research facility at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a sprawling complex where military scientists had tested protective equipment and decontamination procedures since the First World War. In the aftermath of the Second World War, with tensions rising and chemical weapons stockpiles expanding, Edgewood's mission shifted. From 1948 through the 1970s, approximately 6,700 American service members participated in classified experiments exposing them to mustard agents, nerve gases, psychoactive compounds including LSD, and dozens of other chemicals tested for military applications. The soldiers were told they were testing protective gear. Many were never told what they were being exposed to. Declassified medical protocols from Edgewood describe procedures in clinical language that obscures human consequence. Subject presented with transient ocular irritation following exposure to agent. Dermal reaction observed within 24 hours of contact with eyebright. Volunteers exhibited disorientation and temporal confusion after administration of compound. Behind the sterile phrasing, blistered skin that would scar permanently, respiratory damage that would persist for decades, psychological effects that subjects couldn't explain to doctors who weren't cleared to know what had been administered. The experiments were classified, the medical records were classified. When veterans began experiencing long-term health problems and sought treatment, the Department of Defense couldn't acknowledge what they had been exposed to without revealing programs that remained officially secret. Some veterans fought for decades to obtain their own medical records. Others died without ever learning what had been done to them. Congressional investigations in the 1970s finally forced partial disclosure. Testimony revealed that Edgewood had tested substances ranging from riot control agents to experimental incapacitants designed to disable enemy forces without killing them. The research sought to develop chemical weapons that could be deployed with acceptable consequences, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in declassified planning documents. What counted as acceptable was never defined beyond bureaucratic thresholds. Casualties that fell below certain percentages, effects that dissipated within specified time frames, exposure levels that produced manageable long-term complications. The subjects of these experiments were given no such calculations. Even as the Edgewood revelations emerged, other chemical and radiological research programs remained sealed. Files marked for official use only or stamped with higher classifications sat in government archives, their contents protected by national security designations that could be renewed indefinitely. The bureaucratic architecture of secrecy, built during the war and expanded during the Cold War, ensured that some experiments would remain hidden not for years but for generations. One set of files documented research that combined chemical weapons expertise acquired from defeated enemies with radiological knowledge gained from the only nation that had ever used atomic weapons in combat. The intersection of those two programs produced tests that would reshape how governments understood and concealed the human cost of their most powerful weapons. The mushroom cloud that history remembers. The fallout that was never meant to be discussed. The target fleet rode at anchor in the lagoon of Bikini Atoll. 95 warships arranged in concentric circles around a single vessel painted bright orange for maximum visibility. July 23, 1946. Dawn had broken clear across the Pacific, and on observation ships positioned 15 miles distant, sailors watched through welding glass as the countdown reached zero. The first atomic bomb used as a weapon of war had fallen 11 months earlier, This would be the first detonated as an experiment, with human observers positioned to study what happened next. What happened next would remain classified for decades. The device detonated 520 feet above the fleet. The fireball lasted less than a second before expanding into the iconic mushroom cloud that newsreel cameras captured for global audiences. But the cameras couldn't film what happened at sea level. The shockwave hit the water's surface and created something meteorologists would later call base surge, a horizontal wall of radioactive seawater and vaporized coral that rolled outward like fog faster than men could run, coating everything it touched with contamination measured not in traces but in layers. Operation Crossroads had just begun. The second test would prove worse. Baker shot detonated underwater on July 25th, suspended 90 feet below the surface. The explosion created a column of water over a mile wide and thousands of feet high, a hollow tower of ocean lifted by atomic force. When it collapsed, it generated waves that capsized smaller vessels and sent radioactive spray across the entire fleet. Ships 10 miles from ground zero were painted with what one sailor's log described as wet frost, a coating of seawater so contaminated that men who handled the rigging reported numb hands and a metallic taste that lingered for hours. The Navy had planned extensive decontamination operations. Those plans lasted 2 weeks. By August 10, 1946, radiological surveys revealed contamination levels that made decontamination impossible with available technology. Ships that sailors had scrubbed repeatedly with soap, acid, and high-pressure hoses remained lethally radioactive. Equipment that had been cleaned showed no reduction in readings. The target fleet, including captured German and Japanese warships, American cruisers, and submarines, sat in the lagoon emitting radiation that would persist for years. On August 10th, the Navy halted decontamination efforts and declared the operation complete. What it didn't declare publicly was the reason. They had no idea how to clean up what they had created. Classified monitoring reports measured micrograms of plutonium on ship paint flakes, lab results that would influence policy for decades. The data from Crossroads became intensely valuable to military planners. Not just the weapons effects, blast radius, thermal damage, shockwave propagation, but something more disturbing: how radiation moved through an environment, how it concentrated in food chains, how it affected human beings at various distances and exposure durations. The Pacific tests provided real-world data that laboratory experiments could never generate, but publishing that data would require acknowledging exposure levels that exceeded what had been publicly described as safe. So, the data was classified, and the testing continued. March 1st, 1954. Castle Bravo shot at Bikini Atoll. The device was designed to yield 6 megatons. It produced 15, the largest nuclear explosion ever detonated by the United States, and an accident that would contaminate areas far beyond the predicted fallout zone. Japanese fishing vessels, Marshallese islanders on atolls deemed safe, and even American servicemen on observation ships found themselves engulfed in radioactive ash that fell like snow. Hidden inside the Castle Bravo program was a study that would haunt the nuclear establishment for generations. Project 4.1, documented in files that surfaced decades later, explicitly examined the medical response of human beings exposed to fallout after the Bravo shot. The designation appeared in internal memos with clinical precision. Study the effects, document the progression, track long-term consequences. Critics who eventually uncovered references to Project 4.1 argued it constituted human experimentation without informed consent. The populations exposed to Bravo fallout, Marshallese islanders in particular, had not volunteered for medical study. They had simply been in the wrong place when calculations failed and winds shifted. The ethical implications drew intense criticism when declassified, but the data had already served its purpose. Medical teams documented thyroid abnormalities, birth defects, and cancer rates in exposed populations with the thoroughness of clinical researchers. Annual examinations tracked disease progression. Blood samples were catalogued. Tissue biopsies were preserved for analysis. The Marshallese who participated were told they were receiving medical care, which they were. What they weren't told was that their exposure was being studied as a unique data set on human radiological response. The distinction between treatment and research blurred into something that violated principles established at Nuremberg just years earlier. By the late 1950s, the United States had detonated over 200 nuclear devices in the Pacific and Nevada. Each test generated data. Each dataset raised questions about long-term exposure effects, and each question led to studies that were classified because the answers were uncomfortable. Native islanders displaced from Bikini and Enewetak remembered American soldiers distributing canned corned beef and noticing a chemical taste in the water after tests. Details that later appeared in official socio-medical surveys. buried in appendices marked restricted distribution. Those surveys documented rates of thyroid disease and cancer in exposed populations that exceeded normal incidence by orders of magnitude. But publishing the surveys would require acknowledging exposure levels that contradicted public safety assurances issued at the time of testing. The choice was disclosure or credibility. Governments chose credibility. Declassification efforts in the 1990s finally released some radiological monitoring data from the Pacific tests. What emerged painted a damning picture. Fallout patterns had been known in real time, exposure levels had been calculated, in some cases evacuation orders had been delayed, or populations had been returned to contaminated atolls before radiation levels dropped to safe thresholds. The decisions were documented in memos that weighed strategic testing schedules against civilian health consequences, concluding repeatedly that testing priorities outweighed exposure risks to populations that had no political representation. The mathematics were clear, the morality was absent. One document discovered in the National Archives contained a single sentence that captured the entire philosophy. Continued testing requires maintaining public confidence in safety protocols. The sentence appeared in a memo discussing whether to relocate additional islander populations. The conclusion? Relocation would raise questions about previous assurances, better to maintain existing evacuation zones and monitor long-term health outcomes in exposed populations, better to study the effects than prevent them. Would you have spoken up? Would you have risked your career, your clearance, your freedom under secrecy laws? To expose what was being done to people who would never read the reports written about them? That question haunted some of the scientists involved. A few left the programs. Others voiced concerns in classified memos that remained sealed for decades. One researcher's journal, donated to an archive after his death, contained an entry from 1956. We measure, we document, we publish in restricted circles. We never ask the people we study if they consent to being studied. I fear what history will say about us. History would eventually say plenty, but first, more secrets would need to surface. The pattern extended beyond radiological research. Chemical weapons stockpiles, assembled during the Second World War, packaged mustard agent, lewisite, and experimental compounds, had been shipped to remote islands for testing. Those shipments appeared in logistics records marked for official use only, with many entries redacted even in archival releases conducted decades later. Some stockpiles were never recovered. Some disposal sites were never fully documented. The legacy contamination would surface generations later when construction projects unearthed corroded munitions that off-gassed compounds not seen since wartime laboratories. By the time governments began systematic declassification of wartime and Cold War programs, the scale of hidden activity defied simple narrative. It wasn't a single conspiracy, but hundreds of classified projects, each justified by operational necessity, each generating documentation that would be sealed for decades. The files revealed not malice so much as institutional indifference, a bureaucratic willingness to prioritize secrecy over accountability, strategic advantage over ethical constraint. But some files revealed something worse, evidence that governments had learned from each other's worst practices. The Americans who granted immunity to Unit 731 personnel studied Japanese biological warfare data. The British who recruited German chemists learned from Nazi nerve agent research. The Soviets who captured German rocket scientists absorbed lessons about industrial-scale weapons production. Each victor claimed moral superiority while quietly absorbing knowledge from defeated enemies whose crimes they had condemned. The hypocrisy was documented in cables, memos, and reports that remained classified until the political consequences of disclosure had faded into history. What remains sealed today? What files still sit in archives marked with classifications that won't expire in our lifetimes? The Freedom of Information Act request arrived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland on a Tuesday morning in 2003, a historian seeking complete records of chemical weapons testing at Edgewood Arsenal. The archivist processed the request according to standard procedure: locate relevant files, review for declassification, estimate processing time. 3 weeks later, the response arrived in the historian's mailbox. Estimated completion, 18 to 24 months. Reason for delay: mandatory review by Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and intelligence agencies for materials that remain classified 58 years after the war's end. Some secrets age slowly. The machinery of government secrecy operates with bureaucratic efficiency that outlasts the people it was designed to protect. Classification stamps applied in 1945 remain valid until formally reviewed. Review processes require funding, personnel, and political will. resources that government agencies allocate based on priorities that rarely include historical transparency. Files sit in climate-controlled storage, their contents unknown even to the archivists who catalog them, waiting for declassification reviews that may never be scheduled. When files finally emerge, they reveal patterns that explain the delay. A 1998 declassification release included wartime intelligence cables bearing cross-references to research exploitation files, evidence that captured enemy scientific documentation had been parceled for secrecy reviews rather than immediate publication. Some of those files documented German chemical engineers who had worked on taboon and sarin nerve agents. The engineers had left technical notebooks filled with synthesis procedures, weapon designs, and field test results. Allied laboratories captured those notebooks in 1945. Western armies catalogued them, studied them, and embargoed public access while evaluating the agents and developing antidotes. The embargo lasted decades, lifted only when the chemical weapons described had been superseded by more advanced compounds. Similar patterns appeared in files related to biological research. Internal memoranda from the late 1940s show American scientists explicitly arguing that captured German and Japanese pathogen formulas should be studied in secure facilities. The memos acknowledged that acquiring complete research data might require secrecy and possibly immunity for researchers whose methods violated international law. The ethical calculations were never resolved through formal policy. They were simply absorbed into classification protocols that made the debate itself inaccessible to public scrutiny. By the early 21st century, historians armed with declassified documents began reconstructing what had been hidden and why. The picture that emerged was less a conspiracy than a self-perpetuating system. Wartime projects generated classified documentation. Post-war reorganizations created new agencies that inherited those files without complete understanding of their contents. Cold War tensions justified extended classifications to protect strategic advantages. Bureaucratic inertia ensured that files marked secret in 1945 remained marked secret in 2005, not because their content still threatened national security, but because declassification required affirmative action that no one had incentive to initiate. The human cost of that inertia continued accumulating. Veterans of Edgewood Arsenal, who had participated in chemical experiments during the 1950s and 60s, found themselves fighting administrative battles decades later to obtain their own medical records. The records existed, meticulous documentation of exposure levels, symptoms, and long-term health monitoring, but accessing them required proving service connection to classified programs that the government couldn't acknowledge without revealing details that remained officially secret. Some veterans died waiting for records that were declassified only after their deaths rendered the information useless for disability claims. Families of sailors who had participated in Operation Crossroads faced similar obstacles. Radiation exposure records existed in naval archives, but retrieving them required navigating bureaucratic processes that treated wartime radiological data as potentially sensitive even 70 years after the fact. Cancer rates among Crossroads participants exceeded general population norms by measurable margins, but establishing service connection required documentation that lived behind classification barriers designed to protect weapons development secrets rather than personnel records. The Marshallese Islanders, exposed to Castle Bravo fallout, pursued compensation through American courts for decades. Their cases hinged on proving that exposure had been foreseeable, that officials had known the risks and proceeded anyway. The documentary evidence existed in Project 4.1 files and radiological monitoring reports. But many of those documents remained classified or heavily redacted, making it impossible to demonstrate in open court what government scientists had written in secret memos. Legal battles stretched across generations, with many original claimants dying before their cases reached resolution. Justice delayed by classification becomes justice denied. Some secrets emerged only through accidental disclosure. A researcher studying Cold War scientific cooperation requested files on agricultural research in occupied Japan. The archives provided boxes of documents that included, almost by accident, cables discussing Unit 731 immunity negotiations. The cables had been misfiled under agricultural research because they referenced livestock disease studies, cover terminology for biological warfare programs. The misfiling bypassed normal declassification review, and the cables entered the public record before anyone realized what they revealed. Other secrets surfaced when former participants reached the end of their lives and decided truth mattered more than secrecy oaths. A naval officer who had served in the Pacific testing program donated his personal diary to a university archive in 2007, shortly before his death. The diary contained daily observations of radiological contamination at Bikini, including entries describing men handling gear with bare hands that made Geiger counters scream and watches that glowed without radium because the salt spray made them radioactive. The diary had never been classified because it was personal property, but its contents documented exposure levels that contradicted official safety narratives maintained for decades. Each revelation raised the same question: what else remains hidden? The answer is simultaneously precise and unknowable. Government agencies maintain classification guides that list categories of information still considered sensitive: nuclear weapons design details, intelligence sources and methods, cryptographic techniques, chemical and biological agent formulas. But those guides describe categories, not specific documents. A file marked secret might contain genuinely sensitive material. It might contain information that would embarrass officials who are long dead, or it might contain nothing more sensitive than acknowledgement that governments made calculated decisions to prioritize security over ethics, strategy over transparency. The only way to know is to open the files, and opening files requires political will that rarely materializes without public pressure. Modern FOIA requests encounter bureaucratic resistance that echoes wartime secrecy protocols. Agencies respond to requests with GLOMAR responses, neither confirming nor denying the existence of records. Mandatory declassification reviews trigger consultations with multiple agencies, each capable of vetoing release. Processing backlogs stretch years into decades. Fee structures make comprehensive research prohibitively expensive for independent historians. The system functions as designed, protecting information from disclosure unless compelling reasons force release. Some nations maintain even stricter controls. British official secrets laws impose criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure that extend beyond government employees to journalists and researchers. Japanese archives related to wartime activities remain fragmentary, with systematic destruction of records in 1945 followed by limited archival collection efforts. Russian archives opened briefly in the 1990s before access restrictions tightened again. Chinese records of wartime biological attacks and occupation-era experimentation remain largely inaccessible to international researchers. The global architecture of secrecy ensures that some stories will never be fully told. What we know about Unit 731 comes primarily from American occupation files and testimony from a handful of participants who broke silence. Japanese government acknowledgement came decades late and remains incomplete. Chinese victims who survived anthrax and plague attacks died without seeing comprehensive documentation of what was done to them. The biological warfare data that American scientists acquired in exchange for immunity, the data valuable enough to justify sheltering war criminals, remains partially classified in repositories that require security clearances to access. The Edgewood Arsenal experiments were partially disclosed after congressional investigations in the 1970s, but complete documentation remains scattered across military archives subject to ongoing classification review. Veterans groups estimate that thousands of participants were never fully debriefed on what they were exposed to. Medical follow-up studies exist but remain inaccessible without FOIA requests that can take years to process. The full scope of Cold War-era chemical and biological testing on American military personnel may never be comprehensively documented. Operation Crossroads and subsequent Pacific nuclear tests generated mountains of documentation: ship logs, radiological surveys, medical records, photographic evidence. Much has been declassified, much remains restricted. Some files were destroyed in accordance with retention schedules before their historical significance was recognized. Others were simply lost in bureaucratic transfers between agencies. The sailor whose log described metallic-tasting hands and numb fingers left a record that survived. How many similar accounts vanished into paper shredders or flooded basements housing forgotten archives? The question isn't whether governments keep secrets, they must. The question is who decides what remains secret, for how long, and in whose interest. Wartime necessity justified secrecy to protect operational advantages, intelligence sources, and technological innovations. Post-war classification protected strategic assets during Cold War tensions, but extending classification decades beyond any plausible security rationale protects only institutional reputation and bureaucratic convenience. When files finally open, they reveal not ongoing threats, but historical embarrassments. Decisions that would have been controversial if disclosed at the time, programs that violated stated values, calculations that prioritized strategic advantage over human welfare. The pattern repeats across nations and decades. Seal the files, wait for participants to die, allow enough time to pass that disclosure no longer threatens living officials or active programs. Then perhaps allow historians access to fragments of truth that arrive too late for accountability, too late for justice, too late for anything except the historical record. We study these secrets not to judge the past, though judgment may be warranted, but to understand the present. The machinery of government secrecy built during the Second World War remains operational. Classification authorities expanded during the Cold War persist into the 21st century. New secrets are created daily, stamped with classifications that will outlast everyone reading these words. Somewhere in secure facilities today sit files that document programs we won't learn about until 2070 or 2090 or never. Operations that seem justified by current threats may appear differently when examined by historians who possess context we lack. The participants in those programs are bound by secrecy oaths, just as the Bletchley Park codebreakers were bound for 3 decades. When those files finally open, if they open, what will they reveal about the choices we're making now? The question lingers like radioactive fallout, settling slowly over everything, impossible to wash away. We live in the world those wartime secrets created, a world where governments possess the authority to classify truth, the power to maintain silence, and the certainty that some things are better left buried. The files wait in their climate-controlled storage, their contents unknown, their classifications intact, their revelations postponed indefinitely. History doesn't repeat, but secrecy does. The same justifications, the same bureaucratic processes, the same calculation that disclosure would be more damaging than silence. The only difference is time. How long until someone demands the files, fights the bureaucracy, and drags truth into daylight? Some secrets age slowly, others never age at all. They simply wait, sealed behind classification stamps, for a future that may never arrive. And in that waiting lies a question every generation must answer. What are we willing to hide in the name of security? And what cost are we willing to pay when those secrets finally emerge? The envelope will arrive someday, the one marked approved, and we'll discover what our governments did while we weren't looking. By then, everyone responsible will be gone. Only the truth will remain, arriving decades too late to change anything except how we remember.